They say that hatred runs deeper than love, that blood feuds carve scars into the very soul of families that can never heal. I believed that once. I believed it with every fiber of my being, every breath I drew, every sword I raised in my family's name. Until that autumn evening in 1587, when everything I thought I knew about enemies and allies, about duty and desire, crumbled to dust with a single touch. My name is Roderick Ashworth, and at 28 years of age, I had already earned a reputation as one of the fiercest knights in all of Yorkshire. The second son of Lord William Ashworth, I bore the responsibility of defending our family's honor with steel and blood when diplomacy failed. And diplomacy, it seemed, always failed when it came to the Blackthorns. The feud between our houses stretched back more than a decade, born from a disputed inheritance that had torn two once-allied families apart. What began as arguments over land boundaries had escalated into raids, skirmishes, and eventually open warfare that left good men dead on both sides. I had personally led 3 raids against Blackthorn holdings, and I wore the scars of their retaliation like badges of honor across my chest and arms. But that October evening, as golden leaves danced in the crisp autumn air and harvest moon cast silver shadows across the countryside, I found myself doing something I never imagined possible. I was riding toward Blackthorn Manor, not as an invader, but as an invited guest. The invitation had arrived a fortnight earlier, sealed with the Blackthorn crest and written in Lord Edmund Blackthorn's own hand. A harvest feast, he called it, invoking ancient traditions of hospitality that superseded even blood feuds. The missive spoke of honoring old customs, of setting aside weapons for one night to celebrate the bounty of the land we all shared. My father had raged for hours, calling it a trap, a scheme to murder us all under the guise of hospitality. Yet here I was, cantering through the mist-laden meadows that bordered our enemies' lands, my finest doublet replacing my usual armor, a ceremonial sword at my side instead of my battle-worn blade. Perhaps it was curiosity that drove me, or perhaps it was the bone-deep weariness that had been growing in my chest with each passing season of conflict. I was tired of death, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of seeing fear in the eyes of our tenants when they spoke of the Blackthorns. The manor house rose before me like something from a minstrel's tale, its windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Torches lined the approach, their flames dancing in the evening breeze and casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the stone walls. The sound of laughter and music drifted through the autumn air, carried on the scent of roasted meat and spiced wine. I dismounted at the entrance, where a young stable boy took my reins with nervous efficiency. His eyes darted to the Ashworth crest on my cloak, and I saw recognition flicker there, followed quickly by uncertainty. No doubt he had heard stories of the terrible Ashworth knights, just as our people told tales of Blackthorn cruelty. The great hall was a sight to behold, transformed into a vision of autumn splendor. Garlands of golden oak leaves and burgundy maple intertwined with late-blooming roses adorned the walls. Long tables groaned under the weight of the harvest feast, roasted swan and venison, fresh bread still steaming from the ovens, wheels of sharp cheese, and flagons of dark ale and rich wine. The air thrummed with conversation and the melodic notes of lutes and pipes. I recognized many faces among the assembled guests, nobles from across the county who had maintained careful neutrality in our family's conflict. They watched me with undisguised interest as I entered, no doubt wondering what madness had possessed me to accept this invitation. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered behind their hands, but all seemed to understand the significance of my presence here. Lord Edmund Blackthorn himself approached me, and I felt my hand instinctively drift toward my sword hilt before forcing myself to relax. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his bearing still proud despite the lines that warfare and worry had etched around his eyes. We had faced each other across battlefields, had traded blows that left permanent marks, yet here we stood in his hall like civilized men. He extended his hand to me, and after a moment's hesitation, I clasped it. His grip was firm, his gaze steady. "Sir Roderick," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite the surrounding noise. "I confess myself surprised. I did not expect you to honor our invitation." I met his gaze directly, matching his formal tone. "Ancient customs demand respect, my lord. Even from enemies." Something flickered in his eyes at that, perhaps approval, perhaps amusement. "Indeed they do. Come, let me introduce you to our other guests. Tonight, we are all simply men celebrating the harvest." As we moved through the crowd, I found myself studying the faces around me with new eyes. These were not the monsters my father's stories had painted, but people much like those in our own hall. Farmers and craftsmen, minor nobles and their ladies, all dressed in their finest clothes and partaking in the ancient rituals of hospitality and celebration. The wine flowed freely, rich and warming, and despite myself, I found the tension in my shoulders beginning to ease. Conversations bloomed around me, drawing me into discussions of crops and weather, of hunting and hawking, of anything but the conflict that had defined our lives for so long. For brief moments, I could almost forget who I was, where I was, and why this should be impossible. The musicians struck up a lively tune, and couples began to form on the cleared floor for dancing. It was then, as I stood watching from the periphery, that I first saw her. She emerged from a group of ladies near the hearth, moving with a grace that caught my attention immediately. Her hair was the color of burnished copper, woven with threads of gold that caught the torchlight, and her gown was deep forest green with intricate embroidery that spoke of fine craftsmanship. But it was not her beauty that stopped my breath, though she was indeed lovely. It was something else entirely, something in the way she carried herself, the quiet dignity in her posture that spoke of inner strength. As she moved to join the dance, I noticed she favored her left leg slightly, the barest hint of a limp that she disguised with such skill that I doubted many others had noticed. Far from detracting from her grace, it somehow enhanced it, adding a vulnerability that made her seem more real, more human than the painted courtly beauties who usually graced such gatherings. Our eyes met across the hall, and I felt something shift in the air between us, something electric and impossible to ignore. The moment stretched between us like a drawn bowstring, taut with possibility and danger. She held my gaze for perhaps 3 heartbeats before looking away, but in those brief seconds, I felt as though the very foundations of my world had shifted beneath my feet. Who was she? And why did the sight of her make my pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with battle fever? The dance continued around us, couples weaving in and out in the traditional patterns, but I found myself unable to focus on anything but this mysterious woman. She moved through the steps with fluid grace, her slight impediment barely noticeable as she adapted the movements to suit her own rhythm. There was intelligence in her eyes, a spark of wit that suggested depths beneath the courtly facade. It was Lord Blackthorn who provided the answer to my unspoken question. He appeared at my elbow, following my gaze with knowing eyes. "My daughter," he said simply, his voice carrying a note of pride mixed with something else, something that sounded almost like resignation. "Seraphina. Seraphina Blackthorn. The enemy's daughter." The woman whose very existence I had barely acknowledged in all our years of conflict, reduced to nothing more than a political piece in the grand game of noble alliances. Yet here she was, flesh and blood and utterly captivating, dancing mere yards away from where I stood. If you're enjoying this story so far, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Drop a comment and let me know which corner of the world you're in. Your support means everything to storytellers like us. As the music reached its crescendo, tradition demanded that partners change, and I watched as she gracefully accepted the hand of a young lord I didn't recognize. Something twisted in my chest at the sight, an emotion I had no right to feel and no business entertaining. This was madness. She was a Blackthorn, daughter of my family's sworn enemy, and I was standing in their hall like some lovesick fool, watching her dance with other men. The feast continued around us, course after course of rich foods accompanied by increasingly animated conversation. I found myself seated at the high table, positioned strategically between neutral lords who could serve as buffers should tempers flare. The irony was not lost on me that I, who had spent years trying to destroy this family, was now breaking bread at their table, drinking their wine, and accepting their hospitality. As the evening progressed, the formal atmosphere began to give way to something more relaxed. The wine had done its work, loosening tongues and softening the sharp edges of old animosities. Stories were shared, jokes told, and for brief moments, it was possible to believe that peace was more than just a distant dream. It was during one such moment, as the musicians played a slower, more intimate melody, that fate decided to intervene. The dance required all the guests to participate, a great circle that included every soul in the hall. Protocol demanded it, ancient custom that superseded even blood feuds. As the circle formed, I found myself directly across from her. Seraphina Blackthorn stood perhaps 20 paces away, her green eyes fixed on mine with an expression I couldn't quite read. The music began, that haunting melody that spoke of autumn nights and harvest moons, and we began to move. The dance was ancient, older than our feud, older than our family's claims to these lands. It spoke of community, of shared humanity, of bonds that transcended the petty squabbles of mortal men. We circled each other like planets in their orbits, drawn by some invisible force yet maintaining careful distance. Other couples moved around us, but they seemed to fade into insignificance, mere shadows at the edge of my vision. There was only her, only the way the torchlight played across her face, only the graceful way she moved despite her slight imperfection. Then came the moment that would change everything. The moment described in whispered songs and ancient ballads, when enemies set aside their weapons and joined hands in the universal language of dance. The music swelled, the other dancers seemed to hold their breath, and I found myself stepping forward as she did the same. Our hands met in the center of the circle, palm to palm, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that should have been impossible between sworn enemies. Her skin was warm and soft, a stark contrast to my own calloused fingers, scarred from years of sword work. The touch was electric, sending jolts of sensation up my arm and straight to my heart. In that instant, the world around us disappeared. The sounds of the feast faded to nothing. The laughter and conversation became distant echoes. Even the music seemed to slow and deepen, becoming something primal and elemental. There was only her touch, only the way her fingers fit perfectly between mine, only the sudden understanding that passed between us without a single word being spoken. I looked into her eyes and saw my own shock reflected there, my own bewilderment at this impossible connection. How could this be happening? How could the simple touch of her hand feel like coming home after a lifetime of wandering? How could an enemy's daughter make my heart race faster than any battlefield charge? She was studying my face with the same intensity one felt, her green eyes searching for answers I didn't have. Up close, I could see the delicate freckles that dusted her nose, the way her lips parted slightly in surprise, the intelligence that sparkled in her gaze. She was even more beautiful than I had realized, but it was a beauty that went far deeper than mere physical attraction. We stood there, hands joined, hearts thundering, while the world spun around us. The other dancers completed their movements, the music played on, the feast continued, but we were frozen in that moment of connection, that instant of recognition that neither of us had been prepared for. It was she who broke the spell, though I could see the effort it cost her. She gently disengaged her hand from mine, and I felt the loss like a physical blow. The world rushed back in a torrent of sound and sensation, the feast resuming its familiar chaos around us. We stepped back into our respective places in the dance, completing the ancient pattern as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Everything had changed. As the music ended and the dancers dispersed, I found myself struggling to breathe normally. My hand still tingled where she had touched it, and I could swear I could still feel the warmth of her skin against mine. This was impossible. This was forbidden. This was the kind of madness that started wars and ended dynasties. Yet as I watched her retreat to the safety of her ladies, I knew with bone-deep certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The careful walls I had built around my heart, the armor of duty and family loyalty that had protected me for 28 years, had been shattered by a single touch from an enemy's daughter. The feast continued around us, but I barely tasted the food, barely heard the conversations. My mind was consumed with replaying that moment, that electric instant when our hands had met and the world had shifted on its axis. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? How was I supposed to return to my father's hall and pretend that nothing had changed when everything had? As the evening wound toward its close, I caught her looking at me from across the hall, and our eyes met once more. This time, neither of us looked away immediately. Instead, we held that gaze, acknowledging silently what had passed between us, the impossibility of it, the danger of it, and perhaps, the inevitability of it. When I finally tore my gaze away, I knew that I was lost. The days that followed that harvest feast passed like a fever dream. I returned to Ashworth Hall with my mind in turmoil, barely able to concentrate on the mundane tasks that had once given my life structure and purpose. My father questioned me relentlessly about what I had observed at the enemy's stronghold, expecting detailed reports of their defenses, their numbers, their weaknesses. Instead, all I could think about was the way Seraphina's hand had felt in mine, the intelligence that sparkled in her green eyes, the grace with which she had moved despite her slight imperfection. I threw myself into training with renewed vigor, hoping that the familiar rhythm of sword work and physical exertion might drive these impossible thoughts from my mind. But even as I sparred with my men in the practice yard, even as sweat poured down my face and my muscles screamed in protest, I could not forget her. The memory of that touch haunted me like a ghost, appearing at the most unexpected moments to steal my breath and scatter my thoughts. It was during one such training session, nearly a week after the feast, that fate chose to intervene once more. I had ridden out alone to the borderlands between our estates, seeking solitude in the ancient forest that separated Ashworth lands from Blackthorn territory. These woods were neutral ground, too wild and untamed for either family to claim with any real authority, a place where a man could think without the weight of family expectations pressing down upon him. I was watering my horse at a small stream when I heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. My hand instinctively moved to my sword hilt, but what emerged from the shadows of the trees was not an armed enemy patrol. It was a single rider, cloaked and hooded, moving with careful deliberation through the dappled sunlight that filtered through the autumn canopy. Even before she lowered her hood, I knew who it was. Perhaps it was the graceful way she sat her horse, perhaps it was some deeper recognition that went beyond mere sight. When Seraphina Blackthorn revealed her face, framed by copper hair that caught the golden light like flames, I felt that same jolt of electricity that had coursed through me at her touch. She brought her horse to a halt perhaps 10 paces away, close enough to speak but far enough to maintain propriety. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, neither quite believing that this encounter was real. Then she spoke, and her voice was like music in the stillness of the forest. "Sir Roderick," she said, inclining her head slightly in acknowledgement. "I confess myself surprised to find you here." I struggled to find my voice, my throat suddenly dried despite the proximity of fresh water. "My lady," I managed at last. "The surprise is mutual. These woods are far from Blackthorn lands." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth, and I felt my heart skip a beat at the sight of it. "As they are from Ashworth lands," she replied. "Perhaps that is what makes them perfect for a chance meeting between two people who should not meet at all." The implications of her words hung in the air between us like morning mist, beautiful and dangerous and impossible to grasp. She had come here deliberately, just as some part of me had hoped she might. This was no accident, no twist of fate. This was a choice, conscious and deliberate and fraught with peril for both of us. I dismounted slowly, never taking my eyes from her face. "You should not be here," I said, though my voice lacked any real conviction. "If your father's men find you, if my family discovers this meeting." She too dismounted, moving with that same careful grace I had observed at the feast. Up close, in the natural light of the forest, she was even more beautiful than I remembered. But it was not her beauty that held me captive, it was something deeper, something in the way she carried herself that spoke of strength and intelligence and a spirit that refused to be cowed by the expectations of others. "Many things in this world are dangerous," she said, stepping closer to where I stood by the stream. "That does not make them less worthwhile." We were close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes, could catch the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair. Close enough that I could reach out and touch her if I dared, if I were brave enough to cross the invisible line that separated our two worlds. "What are we doing, Seraphina?" I asked, her name feeling strange and wonderful on my tongue. "What madness is this that draws us together when everything we have been taught says we should be enemies?" She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze thoughtful as she considered my question. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful consideration. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "we are discovering that the hatred our fathers bear for each other need not define who we are. Perhaps we are learning that there are bonds stronger than blood feuds, connections that transcend the accidents of birth and family name." Her words struck me like a physical blow, not because they were painful, but because they gave voice to thoughts I had barely dared to acknowledge in my own mind. Was it possible that this attraction, this impossible connection between us, could be something more than mere folly? Could it be, as she suggested, a bridge across the chasm that separated our families? We talked for what seemed like hours but could not have been more than one, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears that we had never spoken aloud to another soul. I learned that she shared my weariness with the endless cycle of violence, my longing for a world where children could grow up without learning to hate before they learned to love. She spoke of books she had read, of philosophies that suggested there might be better ways to resolve conflicts than through bloodshed and revenge. In return, I found myself telling her things I had never shared with anyone, not even my closest friends. I spoke of the nightmares that sometimes haunted my sleep, visions of the men I had killed in battle, of the weight that settled on my shoulders each time I raised my sword in anger. I told her of my secret dream of laying down my weapons forever, of finding a way to build something beautiful instead of simply destroying what others had made. As the sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened around us, I realized that I was falling in love with this woman, this enemy's daughter who understood me better than anyone ever had. It was a terrifying revelation, one that threatened to turn my entire world upside down, yet I found I could not bring myself to regret it. When the time came for us to part, we arranged to meet again in 3 days' time at the ruins of an old chapel deeper in the forest. It was a place forgotten by time, abandoned long before our father's quarrel began, where we could speak freely without fear of discovery. As I watched her ride away through the trees, her copper hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight, I knew that I had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Whatever came next, whatever price I might have to pay for these stolen moments, I was committed to this path. The touch of her hand had awakened something in me that I could not silence, a hope that perhaps love could indeed prove stronger than hate. But even as hope bloomed in my chest like a flower in spring, a darker thought began to take root alongside it. If our families discovered these secret meetings, the consequences would be severe for both of us. And somewhere in the shadows, I sensed there were forces at work that would use our connection for their own dark purposes. Our second meeting took place as planned, in the crumbling ruins of St. Marguerite's Chapel, a forgotten sanctuary that had once served travelers crossing between our lands. Ivy claimed the broken stone walls, and wild roses bloomed through cracks in the ancient floor, their late autumn blossoms filling the air with sweet fragrance despite the approaching winter. It was here, among the remnants of old faith and older dreams, that Serafina and I began to build something that neither of us fully understood but both of us desperately needed. She arrived first, and I found her standing before the altar where generations of lovers had once pledged their eternal devotion. Sunlight streamed through the gaps where stained glass windows had once been, painting her in colors of gold and amber that made her seem like something from a vision, too beautiful to be real. "I was afraid you would not come," she said as I approached, her voice barely above a whisper in the sacred silence of the ruins. I stopped just close enough to see the uncertainty in her eyes, the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide. "I would have come if the very gates of hell stood in my way," I replied, and meant every word. Over the following weeks, these meetings became the rhythm by which I measured my days. We would arrive separately, always careful to ensure we were not followed, and spend precious hours talking about everything and nothing. She told me about her childhood, about the loneliness of being the only daughter in a house consumed by thoughts of war and revenge. I shared stories of my own youth, of the pressure to live up to my elder brother's reputation, of the weight of expectations that had shaped me into the weapon my family needed. But more than our pasts, we talked about our dreams. Serafina spoke of wanting to establish schools for children, regardless of their birth or station, where knowledge could flourish without the shadow of violence. I found myself describing a vision of our lands at peace, of trade and cooperation replacing raids and bloodshed, of a world where our children might grow up as friends rather than enemies. If this story is touching your heart, hit that like button to let me know. Your engagement helps share these tales of love conquering hatred with others who need to hear them. During our fourth meeting, as November's chill began to bite through our cloaks, she brought disturbing news. "There have been strangers at court," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Men from neighboring counties, asking questions about our family's defenses, our alliances, our weaknesses." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. "What manner of men?" "They claim to represent various lords seeking to establish trade agreements," she replied, "but their questions seem more suited to military intelligence than commerce. My father treats them as honored guests, but I have seen how they watch our guards, how they count our men, how they ask about patrol routes." The pieces of a larger puzzle began forming in my mind, though I did not yet understand the full picture. "Have you seen their leader? Could you describe him?" Her description chilled me to the bone. A man of perhaps 40 years, well-dressed but with the bearing of a soldier, pale eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and a tendency to ask pointed questions while maintaining a facade of casual interest. I knew that description, had heard it whispered in taverns and spoken in worried tones by other nobles. Baron Mortimer Vale. A man whose reputation for cruelty and ambition preceded him wherever he went, whose lands bordered both our territories but who had somehow remained neutral in our conflict. Neutral, and apparently very interested in gathering information about both our houses. "Serafina," I said urgently, grasping her hands in mine, "you must be careful around these men. If my suspicions are correct, they represent someone whose interests lie not in peace but in seeing our families destroy each other utterly." She squeezed my hands, her touch sending that familiar jolt of electricity through me even in the midst of our fear. "What do you mean?" I explained my growing certainty that Baron Vale was playing a dangerous game, positioning himself to benefit from our family's mutual destruction. If he could provoke us into a final, devastating conflict, he might well claim both our territories when the smoke cleared and count the survivors on his fingers. As winter deepened and our secret meetings continued, my worst fears began to materialize. Tensions between our houses escalated with suspicious regularity, each incident perfectly calculated to inflame old wounds and prevent any possibility of reconciliation. Livestock disappeared from border farms, only to be found slaughtered with symbols carved into their flesh that implicated the other family. Trade agreements were mysteriously sabotaged, documents went missing, and trusted messengers failed to arrive with crucial communications. Each provocation was followed by retaliation, each retaliation by counter-retaliation, until the fragile truce that had existed since the harvest feast crumbled entirely. My father spoke increasingly of preparing for war, of settling accounts once and for all with the Blackthorn dogs who dared to mock our family's honor. Meanwhile, Seraphina brought equally disturbing reports from her side. Her father's advisers whispered of Ashworth treachery, of evidence that we were planning a massive assault come spring. Baron Vale's men had departed, but not before leaving behind a trail of suspicions and half-truths that poisoned every conversation, every decision, every hope of peace. It was during our meeting in late December, as snow began to fall through the broken roof of our chapel sanctuary, that disaster finally struck. We had grown careless in our desperation to see each other, meeting more frequently as the political situation deteriorated. What we did not know was that we were being watched, our every movement catalogued by eyes we had never seen. As Seraphina and I talked urgently about the escalating tensions, about our growing certainty that we were being manipulated by unseen forces, the sound of approaching horses shattered the winter stillness. We leaped apart instinctively, but it was too late. Through the ruined doorway came a patrol of Blackthorn men-at-arms, led by her cousin Marcus, a young hothead who had never made any secret of his hatred for my family. The scene that followed was like something from my worst nightmares. Marcus drew his sword, his face twisted with rage and betrayal, while his men surrounded us with weapons ready. "Seraphina," he shouted, his voice echoing off the broken stones. "What treachery is this? Meeting in secret with our sworn enemy?" I stepped protectively in front of her, my own hand moving to my sword hilt. "This is not what it appears," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable despite the mortal danger we faced. Marcus laughed bitterly, a sound like breaking glass in the cold air. "Is it not? Then what exactly am I looking at, cousin? What exactly are you doing in this godforsaken place with the man who has killed our kinsman?" Seraphina moved to stand beside me, her chin raised defiantly despite the tears I could see gathering in her eyes. "I am trying to find a path to peace," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am trying to break the cycle of hatred that has consumed our families for too long." But Marcus was beyond reason, beyond hearing anything but the voice of old grievances and fresh betrayal. "Peace," he spat. "With this murderer? With this Ashworth dog who has spilled Blackthorn blood?" The confrontation that followed changed everything. Accusations flew like arrows, threats were made, and in the end, I found myself a prisoner, bound and taken to Blackthorn dungeons on charges of espionage and attempted seduction of a noble daughter. As they dragged me away, the last thing I saw was Seraphina's face, white with anguish, as her cousin's men escorted her back to her father's hall in disgrace. The Blackthorn dungeons were dark, cold, and reeked of despair. Chained to a wall in a cell barely large enough for a man to lie down, I had 3 days to contemplate the ruins of everything I held dear. 3 days to imagine Seraphina's disgrace, her confinement, the rage of her father when he learned of our secret meetings. 3 days to accept that my foolish heart had doomed us both. On the morning of the 4th day, I was dragged before Lord Blackthorn himself for what I assumed would be my final judgment. But fate, it seemed, had one more cruel twist in store. For seated beside the lord of the house, wearing rich robes and a satisfied smile, was Baron Mortimer Vale. Vale was exactly as Seraphina had described him, a man whose pale eyes missed nothing and whose very presence seemed to poison the air around him. He studied me with the detached interest of a scholar examining an interesting specimen, and when he spoke, his voice carried the smooth confidence of a man whose plans were coming to fruition. "Sir Roderick Ashworth," he said, inclining his head with mock courtesy. "How fortuitous that you should be discovered at this particular moment. Your timing could not have been more perfect." Lord Blackthorn's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. "Explain to me," he demanded, his voice shaking with rage, "why I should not have you executed immediately for your crimes against my daughter's honor." Before I could answer, Vale raised a hand in a gesture of false reasonableness. "My lord," he said smoothly, "perhaps we should consider how this situation might be used to our advantage. After all, the young knight's capture provides us with the perfect justification for the final assault we have been planning." The truth hit me like a physical blow. Vale had orchestrated everything. Our discovery, the timing of the patrol, even the escalating tensions between our families. He had been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to spring his trap. Our love, pure and honest as it was, had become the key to his ambitious schemes. "You planned this," I said, my voice hoarse from days without proper water. "All of it. The raids, the missing livestock, the failed communications. You have been manipulating both our families, driving us toward war for your own gain. Vale's smile widened, and I saw the cold calculation that lay behind his courtly facade. An interesting theory, he replied. Though I fear you will have little opportunity to share it with anyone who might listen. It was then that the great doors of the hall burst open, and Serafina entered like an avenging angel. She had clearly fought her way past guards and attendants to reach this chamber, her dress torn, her hair disheveled, but her spirit absolutely unbroken. Behind her came several members of the household, drawn by the commotion. "Father," she said, her voice ringing with desperate determination, "you must listen to me. Sir Roderick speaks the truth. We have all been deceived." Lord Blackthorn rose from his chair, his face darkening with fresh anger. "Serafina. You shame yourself further by appearing here. Return to your chambers immediately." But she stood her ground, moving to place herself between me and her father's wrath. "I will not be silent while an innocent man dies for the crime of seeking peace," she declared. "Baron Vale has played us all for fools, father. He has orchestrated this entire conflict for his own purposes." What followed was the most courageous display I had ever witnessed. Despite the scandal of our secret meetings, despite the damage to her reputation and the fury of her family, Serafina laid out the evidence of Vale's manipulation with the precision of a scholar and the passion of a woman fighting for everything she held dear. She produced letters that had never reached their intended recipients, revealed witnesses who had seen Vale's men near the sites of suspicious incidents, and exposed the true nature of the intelligence gathering that had been conducted under the guise of trade negotiations. Piece by piece, she dismantled the careful web of lies and half-truths that had driven our families toward mutual destruction. Vale's composure began to crack as his schemes unraveled before the assembled witnesses. His denials grew increasingly desperate, his explanations more convoluted, until even Lord Blackthorn could see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. If you're finding inspiration in this tale of courage against overwhelming odds, please consider subscribing to our channel. Stories like this one remind us that love and truth can triumph over even the darkest deceptions. The revelation of Vale's treachery transformed everything. Faced with irrefutable evidence of how they had been manipulated, both families set aside their immediate grievances to address the real threat to their lands and people. My father was summoned under a flag of truce, and for the first time in over a decade, the heads of both houses met not as enemies but as fellow victims of an elaborate deception. Baron Vale's capture and subsequent confession revealed the full scope of his ambitions. He had indeed planned to let our families destroy each other, then move in to claim both territories as compensation for his role in maintaining regional stability. His network of spies and provocateurs had operated for years, carefully stoking the flames of our conflict while positioning himself as a neutral party ready to benefit from our mutual destruction. With the truth finally revealed, the long-standing grievances between our families began to seem not just petty but tragic. How many good men had died because of one man's greed? How much suffering could have been avoided if we had looked beyond our inherited hatred to see the manipulation that had been driving us toward war? The trials that followed saw justice served not just upon Vale but upon the entire corrupt system he had created. His lands were divided between our families as compensation for the damage he had caused, his co-conspirators were exposed and punished, and measures were put in place to prevent such deception from taking root again. But for Serafina and me, the greatest victory was far more personal. Our love, which had begun in secret and flourished in shadows, was finally able to step into the light. What had once been seen as the ultimate betrayal was now recognized as the bridge that had saved both our houses from destruction. Our wedding took place the following spring, in the very chapel where we had first dared to dream of peace. The ruins had been restored, the broken stones rebuilt, the wild roses tamed into proper gardens that bloomed with promise of new beginnings. Representatives from across the county attended, not just to witness our union but to celebrate the end of a conflict that had cast its shadow over the region for far too long. As I stood at the altar watching Serafina approach in her wedding gown, her slight limp transformed into something beautiful by the joy that radiated from her every step, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had begun with a simple touch, a moment of connection amid torches and wine that had changed the course of two families and perhaps the entire region. The lesson of our story is simple yet profound. Love has the power to heal the deepest wounds, to bridge the widest chasms, to transform enemies into allies and hatred into hope. But it requires courage to act upon that love, to stand up to those who would use our fears and prejudices against us, and to choose building over destroying, understanding over judgment, hope over despair. Years have passed since that autumn evening when the world first disappeared at Serafina's touch. Our children play in gardens where once we dared not tread, our people trade freely across borders that once ran red with blood, and our two houses stand united against any who would threaten the peace we have built together. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and my family sleeps peacefully around me, I remember that moment in the chapel ruins when all seemed lost, when it appeared that love would be crushed beneath the weight of inherited hatred. But love proved stronger than hate, truth more powerful than deception, and hope more enduring than despair. The world did indeed disappear that night amid torches and wine, but what emerged in its place was something far more beautiful than what had been lost. It was a world where former enemies could become beloved family, where the touch of a hand could heal generations of wounds, and where two hearts brave enough to reach across the darkness could light the way to a brighter future for all. If these stories of love conquering hatred inspire you, please subscribe to our channel and share this tale with others who might need to hear that even in the darkest times, love can indeed change the world. Until next time, remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from conquest, but from the courage to build bridges instead of walls.